QSO Today episode 393, Hans van die Groenendaal, ZS6AKV. My thanks to Icom America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Hans van die Groenendaal, ZS6AKV, has been a mover and shaker in South Africa amateur radio for as long as he's been licensed, almost 65 years. In that time, he has taken leadership positions in the South African Radio League, represented his country at the International Amateur Radio Union, involved in high-altitude balloon launches, AMSAT South Africa, and a host of projects going back to his early beginning. Hans is an alumni speaker at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo and is my QSO Today. ZS6AKV, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Hans?
Hi, Eric. Yeah, I'm here, and good morning to you.
Hans, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
True, it started very early on. I was about 9 years old, and a friend of mine, we were playing together. We took our high-impedance earphone and took out, in the old days, they still used to use nuts and bolts to connect them. We separated them, and then we had a long wire between the ground floor, and they had a double story, and he was at the top, I was at the bottom, and we were broadcasting to each other. And that then turned into the point where I saw an article on Foxhole Radio. Interesting concept of finding a toilet roll and find some wire and you wind it with lots of tabs, and then you have an old-fashioned blade with a safety pin, and that was your detector, and you connected the earphones, and you could, by tapping the coil, you could listen to a lot of the stations. At the time, I was living in Holland. I was born during the war, and after the war, we emigrated to South Africa, and I got here when I was about 13 years old, and then I started One Wealth Radio, and then I became a shortwave listener. And that eventually took me to 40 meters, and I listened to local hams, and then I met a local ham, and I became interested in amateur radio. At that time, I also started work to train as a telecom technician, and I went to college part-time to qualify further. And when I was 17, I saw an advert of an amateur radio course. In those days in South Africa, you only had to do 12-word Morse code. Now, that's another story in its own. And at the local YMCA, I took that course. And when I turned 18, I got the call sign ZS6AKV. And that's how I started amateur radio. The problem is I could never do Morse, but the radio inspector believed that if you could send, then it wasn't such a problem if you couldn't receive. So when I did my test, I got quite a lot of mistakes. And he said, just leave 3 mistakes and just rewrite the text. I like your sending, so yeah, you can qualify. And I had to wait. I was still 17, and then when I turned 18 at the end, I got my call sign. That was 1957.
Hans, would you consider going as a young teen to South Africa? Would you say that your hometown is in South Africa, and what would that hometown be?
When we came to South Africa, we lived in Johannesburg, and I really took to South Africa immediately. We have 2 languages, English, and my English I didn't speak very well. So Afrikaans was the more natural because it was more closer to the Dutch language, although I had, while I was in Holland in first year of secondary school, I did learn a bit of English and French, but then the English came in handy, and well, English was a compulsory subject at our school. So my hope was Johannesburg, but then I moved, and many years later, I moved to Durban, and then eventually we moved back to Pretoria. So yeah, I've been in 3 cities, but I can really say South Africa is my home. It was from almost day one. I just took to it.
And it's a beautiful country for anyone that wants to travel there. Now, when you took your license test, was there only one grade of license, or have you upgraded through the years, and what does that mean in South Africa?
There was only one grade of license, and that was the full license, which was a ZS. And what you had to do is, once you qualified, you had to use compulsory 1 year or more. A few years later, after I obtained my license, they started introducing a more technical exam. In other words, you also had to learn some of the technology about amateur radio. And then they introduced an examination. I was one of the first lecturers. I was almost about 21, 22. I became one of the first lecturers at our local club and actually passed or taught young people to become radio amateurs. You had to write a technical exam. It was a narrative exam. You had to answer the questions and do calculations and so on. Over the years, they introduced what we now call a monkey puzzle. You just answer one of the answers that's given in the question paper. Then I one day decided, well, I was involved in a lot of the local organizations, decided that we should really bring in young people. Why must you be 18? And so I decided to go and talk to the Postmaster General. So I wrote them a long letter and I motivated, and they turned me down. But eventually I managed to get an appointment, and he invited me for tea. And I sat in this huge office and I explained to him, but why must a radio amateur be 18? And then one of the officials that was in the meeting with us said, because it's dangerous. I said, most of the stuff we work with is actually 12 volt, and it's not a danger. I see any reason. And then the Postmaster General said, no, you think it's a great idea to get young people involved. Then he dropped the age to 12. And so we introduced a novice license, and that became a ZR.
You could have told him, Hans, that walking in a field with a boom slanger is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But he sort of, looked at the official and said, no, it's a crazy argument you've got. So then they introduced another novice license between the ages. You had to be 12 at that time until 25. And then you got a ZR license. Eventually, the two were merged, and the ZR and ZS and ZR became the call sign for the license. There's only one license grade. And then the second license grade is a novice license, and that became a ZU. And then eventually they dropped all age groups. So as soon as you can pass the ZU exam, which is a lot easier than the ZR or ZS exam, then you pass, and there are no more restrictions on Morse code. Morse code is not compulsory. They're not testing it anymore.
So you were the guy that changed the age requirement and maybe even the catalyst for creating these other licenses, and it didn't require the Congress to decide this. It was just the Postmaster General deciding this?
Yeah, the Postmaster General in those days decided on all these conditions, and then that system, of course, changed in South Africa as we changed in 1994 to whatever you like to call it, the Democratic South Africa. Then it changed, and there was a national regulator. Currently, the national regulator is ICASA, the Independent Communication Authority of South Africa, and they now control the licensing. Interestingly is that the South African Radio League sets the exam and marks the papers, and this passes the marks to the independent regulator, and they actually then issue the call signs.
Now, did lowering the age in South Africa, did that have an effect on increasing the numbers of kids that became amateur radio operators in those days?
Not as dramatic as we hoped. Mainly, it's kids of radio amateurs, father or mother or brother is a radio amateur, and those kids were the ones that became more involved. There was a new movement started where they started teaching younger people on a more regular basis in an organized way, but then COVID put an end to all that.
Really? Okay. So everything was moving and then it came to a halt during the COVID crisis?
Yeah, I think now it will start slowly. Our schools are open, so I think the opportunities are now there to restart that process. There are still young people that will take courses. Radio clubs do offer courses, but it's mainly for the full license. But I'm sure that pretty soon they will restart that. I wasn't involved in that part of it. I started moving into satellites and into other sort of more technological things.
Can I ask you, in terms of your professional training, what did you end up doing for a living in parallel to leading amateur radio in South Africa?
I guess that's also quite an interesting question. I qualified in the end as a telecom technician, and then I went to more courses and I got a higher qualification. Then I ultimately worked for a company that was owned by ITT, International Telegraph and Telecommunication Corporation, and I was involved in a project that changed equipment that was used by it was an open line telecommunication system. It was a 12-channel system, and that was still well operated, and I was involved in the conversion of that into a transistorized system. One of the things that my part is to help the factory to actually change over, and then also develop some of the filter coils that we used. And then eventually I decided, I was always interested in writing, because in my whole amateur radio career, I did quite a lot of writing. And then I was involved, the company, ITT's company was called Stellar Telephones and Cables in South Africa. And they invited me to actually join their public relations team as a technical writer. And from there, I went to an advertising agency as a technical writer. And then I started my own PR business. And then ultimately, when things, around 1994, the economy was pretty bad in South Africa at that time. And I was invited by the National Telecom Company to head up their PR offices in Durban. And that in itself was an interesting story, because I got so much experience to spend time with rural people. Because one of the problem was in the politics of this country, you had different tribes. And what happened is they started introducing public telephones in rural areas, because they believed that would help development. The problem always was, where did you put that public telephone? Because you find on one side of that highway, there are one group of people, and on the other side is a different group of people. Now, where do you put it? And my job was to try and convince the two to work together so they can both use the telephone. So that was an interesting kind of thing. And then eventually they decided, no, PR had to be centralized, and I was sent to Pretoria. And I was a senior manager in the public relations department of Telkom. And eventually I retired from that, and then I became an editor of Engineer IT. I started as a feature editor, and now I'm the editor, Engineer IT, and it's a magazine, business-to-business magazine. We write about a number of subjects, particularly in computing, telecommunication. So, my career has taken many turns, Eric.
Well, that's really amazing. One of the things I'm interested in, and I saw this doing a little bit of research, that you actually had some understanding and perhaps even hand on the rollout of broadband over powerline carrier in South Africa. Can you tell me how that went and what effect that might have had on South African hams at the time?
It actually never took off. There were a couple of projects. I'm also represent amateur radio on the South African Bureau of Standards, who has a committee that looks after noise and things like that, regulatory things. And they were looking at regulations on broadband over power line. It was called power line telecom in this country. There were a couple of trials. There was a trial here in Pretoria, which I visited, and I used to speak to them regularly. But we were concerned that BPL, as you guys call it, would become a problem in South Africa. But eventually, it never took off, because what happened is that our mobile systems developed fast, and then fiber came pretty fast, and there was no need for BPL. It never worked very well. And there are maybe one or two smaller systems in-house, in buildings, but generally it died.
And now this message from Icom America. Now is the time to spice up your ham shack with Icom's new ID52A handheld portable radio. Now shipping. This radio is perfect for staying in or venturing out and working your favorite VHF and UHF bands this winter season. Did I say that the Icom ID52A is now shipping? Icom's newest handheld radio is a VHF-UHF dual bander with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The Icom ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and the ability to send photos over D-Star with a connected Android device. Other ID52A features include a wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It supports VU, VU, and dual DV mode. It has an integrated GPS GLONASS receiver, including grid square locations. Other features include micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer and programming and charging, and of course it is IPX7 waterproof in case you drop it. Be sure to check out the new Icom ID52A at your nearest ham radio dealer, along with a full line of amazing Icom radios. And when you make that Icom purchase, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. Let's get back to the radio club, the South African Radio League, and I'm assuming that's the national club of South Africa. But then every area, every city perhaps has a local amateur radio club. How do those amateur radio clubs function as a subset of SARL, and what kind of job are they doing right now?
SARL is the same as ARRL. It's the national society. It deals with all the regulatory people. It interfaces with SABS. It interfaces with the independent regulator. And they had branches. So they were just branches of the SRL. But in later years, people decided they didn't like all the interference from the national body they had to follow the rules that the SRL put. And then they changed that, and then they became independent radio clubs. So there are quite a number of radio clubs, and some are very active, and some are not very active. Some radio clubs will organize courses, and we have an exam twice a year. So twice a year they run a course, and they will help to invigilate the examination. It's not online. The examination is physical in a building. And they run different projects, but the SRL itself still has some overriding projects, and we run kind of like seminars, particularly these days online, or workshops online. So the structure is informal radio clubs that have their own structure, and then we still have the national structure that does some overriding teaching and or developing sort of technology in amateur radio. If you like the Beacon program that the SRL is currently, and I'm also involved with, which is the next generation beacon, where the beacons they're digital, and it's a new kind of system. It's quite interesting. It's quite a number of those in Europe that work very well.
You made a presentation about, I believe, those beacons at the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes page. How do the South African amateur radio clubs follow up? If you've got license exams twice a year, how do they follow up with the new hams that have gotten these licenses to make sure that they have success at the end of the day?
That's a big problem. They don't. Shortly after each exam, have a kind of like a contest for newcomers. But and that's one of the things that we're struggling with. And COVID hasn't helped that because of the lockdowns and all that, and not having meetings in person. But that follow-up is not good. And we lose a lot of amateurs or new amateurs. After a year or so, they lose interest, particularly the younger ones. As soon as they get to about 17, 18, then their interest changes and there's no follow-up. You find some of them may come back in later years, but That's one of the problems we're struggling with, and the SRL is very aware of that, and it's actually on their agenda to see what else can they do to do that, to make sure that we have that follow-up, but it doesn't exist right now.
So you actually have this resource of interest, at least to go and to take the course and pass the test, but it's that lack of follow-up that actually is leading to the lack of success in terms of building amateur radio numbers in South Africa. I think this is true everywhere, but I'm interested to hear how it's happening in South Africa as well.
You must also think that we're quite sparsely populated in many areas, so it's maybe easier for the main centers. But that's why we tried to run workshops, and we only had a couple of virtual workshops last year and the year before. This year we decided we should step that up, because one of the big things is when you teach young people to become radio amateurs, you must not teach the technology only. You must teach the culture. They must understand the culture, and they must see that amateur radio is not a thing where you can like almost glorified CB, where you can talk to people and you can make friends overseas. There's more things. There's a lot of experimentation that can be done, and there are already amateurs that are doing that. The trouble is, I think you made that point earlier, is that people don't share very easily, and that's perhaps the issue. And so we're actually looking at that now, and yeah, I'm always maybe unpopular by saying that radio amateurs need to look at technology. FT8 is amateur radio. Some of the digital activities that we have in amateur radio is amateur radio. It's not just, it always reminds me the day that AM was superseded by SSB, it took about 10 years for people to really start accepting single sideband from when it first was muted and developed.
Isn't that interesting? I made an argument in an earlier episode of the podcast that FT8 created an opportunity for all of the manufacturers to continue to create radios at a time when the Sunspot Cycle 24 was at its bottom and it seemed like nothing was really working. I think that the digital modes were a breath of fresh air that kind of reinvigorated over the last 10 years amateur radio and the availability of equipment and perhaps even some innovation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I've also made that point several times. It's interesting that, you see, the whole problem, I believe, is that because we had a low sunspot count and propagation was poor and it wasn't easy to work DX, but my argument was always DX is fine, but that's not the only reason why you become a radio amateur. There are many more interesting things you can do. And perhaps FT8 at least started that process. But it also led to a lot of new innovation. There's so many new projects that we see. Now what we do is we need to share those projects, and we need to get more people involved in doing that. And I believe that if we do that, then we will get the youngsters back, because young people these days only think digital.
They do indeed. You were an early pioneer in balloon amateur radio. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was an interesting time. There was a radio amateur, Dave Woodall, who came up with the idea. Yeah, there were some obstacles. Where would you launch it? How would you launch it? What about the air traffic control people and so on? So I was perhaps more involved in that part of it. Then we built a number of systems. There were some of the radio clubs became involved. In those days, there were still branches. And we developed a digipeater and also a parrot repeater. And they were launched on a balloon. It was quite interesting because everybody says you must use helium, but we didn't. We used hydrogen. And that posed a problem in terms of the fire regulations, but we convinced the fire department, so they came and gave us a fire suit for the guy that filled the balloon, and they were supervising us, and then we launched the balloon. And there were quite a number of these projects. It was quite expensive because those big weather balloons were expensive and not easy to come by in South Africa. That project really took off for quite a number of years, but it also faded again. And then we saw that the Americans started doing balloon launches. And in the last few years, we have one radio club that is now regularly, at least once or twice a year, launch balloons. And what, to their credit, what they do is they get at least 3 or 4 school groups involved. So they're now focusing that as an opportunity for young people to build part of that equipment. They also developed that balloon system so that we can launch maybe up to 20 different smaller payloads. And the last one was in October last year. Currently, they only seem to be doing one a year. But in October last year, they had about 20 projects. We also had the satellite that AMSAT SA is building. We had a prototype that flew. A couple of the schools actually had radio clubs that sort of like small groups, and they built some equipment which flew on that balloon. Yeah, it's an interesting project, and I think it also draws amateurs back to technology. So we need to do more of them, but it's a costly business. And again, for the past 2 years, it was quite difficult to bring people together legally.
Do you think that there's a unique innovation that came from the South African balloon project, other than being the pioneers in doing it?
I think perhaps the innovation is perhaps the way we constructed the payloads, but also perhaps I think the latest one is that they developed a balloon control system that was used at the last launch, which actually has a camera and monitors the behavior of the balloon from the top. It collects a lot of additional telemetry for the sort of like airflows and what happens up at 20,000 meters or 60,000 feet and even higher. Maybe, I have not seen anybody else doing that, but that's what one of the radio clubs here developed. It's one of our rural radio clubs in a place called Secunda.
So these balloons aren't necessarily balloons that travel worldwide. They go up to 100,000 feet, and then they come down. Either the balloon bursts and the payload parachutes down. So you actually have people that chase the balloon or chase the payload when that happens?
Yeah, we don't allow the balloon to go outside the borders. Also, they monitor the flight path because the APRS allows you to follow, or for just about anybody to follow the balloon's path. And then when the balloon gets too far out of reach or goes to an area where you cannot recover it, because a lot of that equipment you can reuse. In the first ones, we didn't worry too much about it, that if we could recover the balloon, it was okay. But now they recover the balloon, and there's quite a number of people that chase it, that follow the balloon, and then they recover it. Our recovery is quite quick, sometimes within an hour of the balloon having descended, because there are 2 ways of doing it. Either you release the balloon if it gets to an area where you don't want it to descend, so you release the balloon in the package, and the package will come down on the parachute, and you can almost predict where. Other times, when you're not so lucky, like our last one, it bursts. And fortunately, more or less where it is. So the chasing teams, there's about 3 or 4 teams that will run after it or drive after it and then recover the packages. Then the packages are taken back to the individual builders and they analyze what's going on, because a lot of those packages also have their own telemetry recording system on board.
Do you have any problems recovering these packages from, say, national parks?
We don't allow the balloon to go to areas where we can't recover, but national parks wouldn't be a problem. It is mainly, sometimes it goes onto a private property, onto a farm, and then you have to first make sure you convince the farmer. So they try and let the balloon descend in those areas. So it's very controllable because you can monitor the flight path all the way.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Now, you're tracking with APRS. Does that mean that because of the balloon's elevation, that tracking with APRS is actually pretty easy? You don't need an APRS network. But does South Africa have an extensive APRS network for tracking vehicles and personnel on the ground?
We have some networks. I wouldn't say it's extensive. I'm not too fully informed on that.
We had this conversation before we pushed the record button. I would say that you're an early podcaster, although at the time that's probably not what they said, but essentially you were an early person into creating audio programming for ham radio. Could you talk a little bit about what that was and when that started?
I tried to even find the dates of when it started, but it was maybe in the 70s, early 70s. What we did is one of the branches of the South African Radio League, called the Johannesburg branch, they ran news bulletins on a Sunday morning. And then we decided we have this opportunity for all these listeners, so let's include some additional stuff. And we started introducing short talks and discussions and all that. And that ultimately developed into an hour program. It used to be called ZS6TJ, which was the call sign. That eventually then took on a more formal format, and then it was called Amateur Radio International. We had some interesting news. We got news from various sources in the United States, sometimes Europe, local sources of news about amateur radio and shortwave listening. We also had a partnership with Centec. Centec is the national signal distributor in South Africa that runs all the radio and FM transmitters. But they had a service called Radio RSA, which was South Africa's international service, and they actually made two transmitters. So Amateur Radio International, later called Amateur Radio Today, went out into Africa on two frequencies in the commercial broadcasting bands, one of a 100 kilowatt transmitter and one of a 500 kilowatt transmitter. Now that lasted quite a last number of years, but only about 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, the national signal distributor decided that it was no longer viable. They weren't going to get the kind of money from government to keep that station going. The station was, the transmitters were aging, antennas were becoming old and used to frequently break or fall over. So they ended the service, and that ended us. But we had already, for quite a few years before that, we started off with cassette tapes, and we used to distribute that to different people to rebroadcast. That we changed ultimately, of course, to digital, and then it became a digital podcast available on the SRL website. It still is today. And it gets picked up by a number of relay stations around the country, and they broadcast at different times. The first broadcast is at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. There are other stations that will do it during the week, like a Monday. We still have some amateur radio. We have a broadcast on the 80 meter band, and on Sunday mornings we also use 40 meters and some relays on 20 meters because propagation between Johannesburg and Cape Town, for instance, right now 20 meters would be more useful than 40 meters. So that's what we do, but a lot of people listen to it digitally, and it's available every Sunday morning on our website. And yeah, I've been producing that. My partner was at a 6BTD originally. We did it for many years, and when he decided, was quite a bit older than me, and he decided to retire and spend his time on some other things. And then a guy in Durban took over, Laurie Devereaux, with ZS5 Delta Lima. He passed away. So I'm on my own, and I do it every week, but I have a number of other people that broadcast it on local repeaters. Interesting, we have contributors, obviously, and we have the Astral National Bulletin. Then we have a DX column. We also talk about a thing called Focus on VHF and Above, and we also talk about HAMNet, which is our emergency communication network. And then we have different people, speakers that we often use from ARL. We sometimes use some of your material.
I actually had a listener call me from Mount Kilimanjaro, where he had a shortwave receiver, and he says, I'm listening to the QSO Today podcast being broadcast from South Africa over shortwave. I thought that was cool. I didn't know about it, but it sounds to me like some of my material actually ended up being broadcast from there.
We use parts of because yours is long, and then we use maybe 20 minutes of it, and then we then give the URL for people to actually log on and listen to the full program.
Well, I felt it was cool at the time. Are you syndicated? The QSO Today podcast is syndicated, so we're all over the place. Are you doing syndication for your project as well?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, great. So any podcast player perhaps can actually pick up the Amateur Radio Today podcast.
Yeah, they can only pick it up if they log on to the Astral website. So, yeah, it's not syndicated in the way you describe it, no. This interesting is we have a broadcast station in New Zealand, a local broadcast station in one of the small towns that actually broadcasts it on a Tuesday.
Oh, we can talk afterwards. If you have an interest in syndication, I'm happy to.
We have an interest in that because it would be great.
It's nice to be on a podcast player. With all your other things, people can just line you up. I'm assuming, based on so far on the conversation we've had, that what you guys are doing in South Africa is very interesting. It's my understanding that, obviously, this is something that you've even pointed to, that you were South Africa's AMSAT president. What does AMSAT do in South Africa in addition to the early ballooning and the CubeSats? What is the project of AMSAT South Africa?
Basically, it was to develop an interest in amateur satellites. And South Africa launched 2 satellites that had amateur payloads on it. The first one was by the University of Stellenbosch, and I was quite involved in that project. So what happened is we got the opportunity on it was called Sunset. And on Sunset, they actually had an amateur radio transponder. Sunset was launched in the US, and it really was a great satellite, and it was very popular. It had a transponder. Our uplink was 2 meters, downlink was 70 centimeters. And it became very popular in parts of the US for demonstrating amateur radio to schools because obviously the signal was great. I was very involved in the development of that, and in fact, they awarded me an honorary engineer degree from the University of Stellenbosch for all the work that I'd done on that process. Then there was another satellite that the government decided to build, and that was called Zamandila-set. Now, interestingly, is we were giving like 3 months' notice to build a transponder. Now, that quite frankly was not possible. So what we ultimately did is we figured out there were 2 commercial transponders that were built by the university on that satellite project. And that satellite, then what we developed was an interface. So you could have it could perform as an amateur radio transponder, but it would also be a parrot radio and things like that. So ultimately, we did manage to ship that to the developers, which was still University of Stellenbosch, which then had started a spin-off company called Sunspace. And they incorporated all that. And then the launch was a strange story because it was going to be launched from a Russian submarine. But that never materialized because there were some international disagreements about that process. And then for many years, the satellite is set, and then eventually some interaction between the 2 different governments of South Africa and the Russians then got launched in Kazakhstan from the Baikonur Space Center. And the interesting thing is that the first thing that was heard when the satellite was switched on was the amateur radio beacon. There was a beacon on board that was a voice beacon. So The interesting other thing is that SAT2 was very popular around the world, but the problem was that the actual transponder that carried amateur radio worked, but the other one didn't work. So all the commercial or the science payload, which was really a camera, then was operated on more often than what the amateur payload was. So people in the rest of the world had lots of opportunity, but while the satellite came over South Africa, they used the camera for the official project. That's how we became involved. And we decided, well, eventually now what we have to do is we will build our own satellite. And we started the CroupSat project, and we now, it's taken about quite a few years, about 4 years now. And then we decided midstream to change. We went from analog to a software-defined radio transponder. It works very well. The problem now is we can't build the final engineering prototype because the ICs or all the various components that we're using are in short supply. And the problem now is that you develop something, but if you don't develop it quick enough or you don't buy enough stock of a particular component that you are using, then the component gets replaced with a new development. So now you've got to stock up a large number of these things. So as your project takes obviously slower. But we built the whole thing ourselves, different people in different parts of the country, developed the old space frame, which we then had re-engineered because originally the space frame was about 500 grams and you can only launch 1.3 in a single CubeSat, 1.3 kilograms. So now we brought down, re-engineered it, nice aluminum space frame. It now weighs about 190 grams. So the rest of the space is taken up. Right now, the development is to develop the mechanism that will let the antennas free. And also we have 4 pull-out or panels that like little doors that will open after launch. So that's what we're working on right now.
Are you a QO100 operator?
I'm not. I have all the equipment, but I live in a residential complex and I have some problems with antennas.
So you have to figure out how to disguise it, as somebody told me in a previous podcast, as like a mulberry tree or something like that.
Yeah, our properties in a residential complex are quite small, but I haven't given up on that. But it's still one of my projects to do. But I keep so busy with the podcast and all the other initiatives that one gets very little time to actually do too much hands-on, going now and then.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. For the American listeners who may not know it, the QO100 is the Qatar Telecom satellite that has an amateur radio transponder that's over this hemisphere. So those of us from the east coast of Brazil all the way to India, I think even into China, have access to this satellite, this geosynchronous satellite. What do you think the possibility is, Hans, of commandeering a commercial satellite over the American hemisphere and turning perhaps its transponder into an amateur radio transponder without having to put up a new satellite? Is there any possibility of that? Have you heard in the AMSAT circles those kinds of talks?
There are ideas at AMSAT North America to develop their own satellite ultimately that would piggyback on another geostationary. The problem is that transponders that are on geostationary satellites are not really suited for the amateur frequencies. And I don't think that conversion is, I think they've investigated it, but I believe that there's 1 or 2 universities in the US that are considering building transponders. But at this point, I think AMSAT North America is just looking at some of the newer technologies, because all these satellites, all the Oscars are many analog. There were no SDRs. So I think that the big movement in the US is really developing new technology, and I think AMSAT North America is doing some great things. I was involved in the for many years, as one of the hats I was wearing in the IAU was the International Satellite Amateur Radio Frequency Coordinator. I did it for over 20 years. So every radio amateur organization or any university that was launching a satellite on amateur frequencies would have to come to me, and I had a panel of experts that we would meet once to actually try and organize all these various frequencies. And ultimately, the decision out of that panel came that we shouldn't have uplinks on 2 meters because of the proliferation of people that are operating clandestine on 2 meters in some parts of the world, and that would upset and rebroadcast on the 70 centimeter band. So eventually it was decided that 70 centimeters would be the preferred up, and then 2 meters the preferred downlink. But after many years, so many universities became involved, particularly in the US, that it became almost US and China and some parts of Europe, that it became like almost a full-time job, and I just couldn't manage all that. So somebody else took over about 4 years or so ago. But that was interesting because it brought me to attend various seminars or workshops in the US. I met many of the astronauts that used to attend, give talks in the US, and also some of the people in the UK.
At least from the state side, that role is probably filled by a representative from the ARRL. But in countries outside the United States and smaller countries even like Israel, how important is it to have a representative there?
Yeah, I think it is, because ultimately it drives IAUs, of course, in 3 regions. And ARRL, AMSAT UK, runs a colloquium every year. And I attended many of those as the satellite advisor for IAU. So, yeah, giving up the job also stopped that opportunity. But, yeah, there's sometimes time for somebody else to take over. And the guy in Holland took over from me.
How important do you think it is for amateur radio organizations to send representatives to the IARU?
How can I put it that way? The president and the main body is managed or is financed partially by the ARL, or majority of it comes from ARL. And then the other national societies, you have then Region 1, which is Europe, and Region 3, which is the Australias in that area. Their national societies contribute to their region, and they contribute then to the overall one. But I think it's important for national societies to actually attend the IAU. There's a conference every 3 years, but the last ones have been, of course, the last one was virtual, the Region 1. I'm not sure about Region 3 or Region 2, which is US. But I've met many delegates from Israel and from many countries when I attended those meetings. I was on the executive committee for two 3-year stunts. Weren't supposed to be for more than 2 3-year sessions on the executive committee. But yeah, it was interesting. You learned a lot. You shape the way things go. And that's what IAU is now trying to do again.
What's the current rig at ZS6AKV?
Oh, you know what? It's a Kenwood. And if I don't look at my notes, I can't tell you the numbers. I've got a TS590 on HF. I also got a Linker HF. And I got a TH811E on VHF. And I also have its equivalent on 70 SEM. The antennas I'm using, inverted Vs. And I have a multi-band vertical from 10 to 80 meters.
Well, that's very interesting. But is this at your QTH, or do you remote control these? Because you just mentioned that you are living in an area where you couldn't have a satellite dish antenna. Or would you need a bigger dish, being so far south that it would be larger than a television dish?
No, the television dish will work. I just have to find a space for another one, because home television is satellite television. So that is a dish, and I have a dish here and all the necessary stuff, but I need to find another structure to put it up. And it's the body corporate of these home estates are not too keen on having too many antennas. I passed the first one. When satellite television came to South Africa, what we did is I just moved in here. because I came from a large property where it's nice because I had lots of antennas and beams and stuff like that. But when I moved here about 20 odd years ago, we did a survey and we said to all the members of the body corporate, do we need permission to put up antennas, meaning dishes? And they said no. So on that basis, I put up the vertical and the inverted B, and I have a satellite dish. But I don't have a satellite dish for Oscar 100, but it's still in my to-do list, and I do have the dish, and I have some of the necessary equipment that I'm busy, have been collecting. Just now need to get to the point finding where do I put it somewhere around the back of the house that it's not so visible, because the dish for that satellite doesn't have to be high up. It can be quite at ground level.
Yeah, I have the same project going here, and then I discovered that where I want to put it, like outside my window, but not in my view of the beautiful hills looking out my window, is on the north side of the house, and I need to be pointed south. So then I'm figuring out how to put that dish on the front of the house so that it doesn't tee off Karen, my XYL, because it's obvious there. So now I'm playing these games in terms of how I'm going to do this in such a way to get on the air with it, but not make it look like an eyesore for the neighbors. Although I think probably most of the neighbors wouldn't notice it if I didn't point it out to them. What is your favorite operating mode, Hans?
2 meters, obviously, FM and on HF SSB. I'm not a CW fan. As I told you right at the beginning, I never was very good at it. And although I did finish my first year and worked quite a lot of DX when CW was compulsory, but I never really took off. It wasn't my favorite.
Does South Africa have an extensive VHFUHF voice network?
Yeah, we have repeaters in many cities, and also we have linked systems. There are some areas of the country where it's linked over thousands of kilometers, where you can access different repeaters. I'm not a big repeater fan. If I really get some operating time, I only look around for 20 meters, 40 meters. 20 meters was, of course, dead for a long time, but it's becoming live. 15 is becoming alive.
I listen to 20-meter CW here during the day. I'm always amazed how well it works. I'm new to 20 meters, so listening to it during the day, it's really fun. What's on your workbench?
You mean technology-wise?
Yeah, what's the next project?
I don't have a full-time workbench. My stuff is nicely stacked in my study or shack, if you like, in one corner. So when I want to do something, I need to take it out. But what my next project is actually to build a system to monitor the next generation beacons that we are busy developing. And I need to build that. And then also I have another project that I was involved with using a Raspberry Pi to do monitoring in a noise monitoring project. Those are the two projects that are standing the site. And yeah, I need to find the time. But it's a problem when you have a small work area. You've got to take it like outside and stick it on a table outside and got your soldering irons and all that kind of stuff.
Fortunately for you, it sounds to me like you've got pretty good weather most of the time.
Yep, it's time.
That's right, time. That's what I don't have either. What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
The greatest challenge is to bring amateur radio to accept new technology, that we must move ahead and we must experiment more. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to keep our frequencies.
Essentially as a justification for our international parks in the airwaves.
Yep.
It's our justification for keeping it. I find that true, by the way. Here in Israel, all of a sudden, I have got a repeater in the UHF amateur band, and all of a sudden, I've got a DMR-like repeater 12.5 kc away from me. I don't know where it came from, but it turns out it appears to be the city that I live in has put in a security system, and it happens to be in the amateur band. So if we're not careful, if we don't show enough activity in our band, then all of a sudden we end up having a military or government interest next to us that is not even coordinated. They didn't ask us, so they just did it, and it creates a source of interference.
Fortunately, they can't do that here yet. The regulations are pretty strict. Amateur bands cannot be used for any other non-radio licensed radio amateur. But yeah, the pressure is on. We have some very valuable frequencies. And if we don't start using more of them, particularly in the microwave bands, and there's not enough projects going on. And that's one of the things we're trying to look at to promote and encourage those few people that are doing that to share their information and help other people going in that direction.
I agree 100%. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio?
I think is all that new stuff. If you look at beacons and propagation, there's such a vast areas to be discovered in tropospheric propagation. Why can you all of a sudden work 2,000 kilometers on 2 meters? And not necessarily during the highest sunspot cycles, when obviously you get all sorts of other phenomena. You get sporadic E and things like that. But what about tropospheric propagation? What is it? How is it driven, and why does it happen? And the problem is, we know when it happens, but we never find out why it happens. And that's one of my interests, and I'm heavily promoting people to start working on areas like that. And that's why we're looking at remote beacon monitoring on our 2-meter beacon system that SRL is at the moment working on, and saying, well, more people should be doing that. We should have remote beacon receiving stations that report back to the internet. That information must be recorded. It must have weather information, other interesting information. That why does it drive tropospheric propagation? That kind of thing excites me.
Now, we were talking a little bit earlier before we started that you actually have an interest in hampsite, right? The organization based out of North America that is actually doing this kind of propagation research and kind of a distribution of like Raspberry Pi type receivers around the world for this?
Yeah, to me, one of the most interesting projects they're involved with is a personal space weather station. Because after all, if you can start monitoring space weather in your area or contribute to that, the whole basis of HAM is that you have a handful of scientists, but you have a large body of radio amateurs that can contribute and make things happen, provide that kind of like research that is difficult to do by a handful of people. I think it's a very exciting project. I think they're doing great work.
Hans, what advice would you give to new returning hams to the hobby?
My advice to returning hams is start looking at where the new technology goes. Engage yourself in the new things in amateur radio, because that's where the future lies. And there's so much to be learned, and there's so much fun to be had by doing these kind of things. Amateur radio is more than just talking and taking part in the contest.
I think that you're right. It's a lot of things. It's 1,000 tents.
Yep.
Hans, thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really appreciate your perspective, especially from South Africa, a different place than we're used to talking. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thank you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Hans. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in ZS6AKV in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.